So it's a real honor to be back here and to once again think with you a little bit about some things. I have talked about this congregation in many different contexts. If you want to come and have a substantive engagement about theological issues and the way they touch on life, faith, politics, the world, this is the place that you want to be. Rarely have I been in a congregation with such intellectual firepower and with so many people who are engaged with their intellect in the service of the larger good and of the populace of this country, and then in fact of a global populace. So it's great to be back. I want to think with you for some sessions about the relationship between the New Testament, specifically the Bible really generally, and the common good. And I want to give you some background on how I came to be thinking about that question, and then share with you how I want to explore that topic by looking at the Gospel of Matthew as an entree point into the New Testament. A few years ago, I was in the fortunate position of having a conversation on behalf of Princeton Seminary with a man in California named Faribors Masih. Fascinating man who'd been born and raised in Iran, come to MIT and done a PhD in engineering, had made several important inventions related to flight controls, and is now the CEO of a large corporation. And we were talking about a Princeton Seminary graduate named Samuel Jordan. Very interesting story. So Faribors Masih, not a Christian person, would identify with the Zoroastrian faith. And so quite unusual that he would be dedicated to and know everything about a Princeton Seminary graduate from the year 1899. So Samuel Jordan grew up in Pennsylvania. He went to seminary at the Princeton Theological Seminary and decided he wanted to go into the mission field. And so he went to Persia. And he, as many of those missionaries from Princeton Seminary did, founded a school. Our graduates tend to take academics very seriously. That's always been one of the values of Princeton Seminary, one of its core commitments. And so one of the ways that Princeton Seminary graduates have done their work is to go forth and to found schools. Lots of colleges and universities in the United States and all over the world founded by Princeton Seminary graduates. So he founded this school, middle school and high school, for the local children. And that school was a place where he did his work for almost 50 years. And he mentored a young Iranian who became the headmaster after him. So was the headmaster into the 1980s, I believe. And this school became All Boars High School in Iran. And I learned this from Dr. Jordan because Dr. Jordan was, from Dr. Masih. Dr. Masih was a graduate of that high school. And we learned about Dr. Masih because he named a Center for Persian Studies after Samuel Jordan at University of California, Irvine. That's how we learned about him. We said, why is there a Samuel Jordan Center for Persian Studies at the University of California, Irvine? So I went out to meet him and to hear his story. And so he told me about this school and how important it was. And he said to me, when you hear about the left-leaning, modern, Western sympathetic intelligentsia in Iran, many of them have been educated at All Boars High School. It's had a very significant role in mitigating religious extremism in Iran. And I'm very grateful for the education I got there, which set me up for a successful life in every way. And so Dr. Jordan was the mentor of my mentor, and so I'm grateful to him. And so we were talking about this, and at one point he said to me, I'm so grateful for Dr. Jordan, even though he failed in his mission. said, I had just listened to this beautiful story about this high school that he founded, which still, to this day, plays this significant role over 100 years later. And I said, what do you mean he failed in his mission? And he said, well, he came to convert the Persians. And that didn't happen. There weren't any Christians that came out of his work, but still he had this beautiful high school that has served students for over 100 years. And I said to Dr. Masih, he didn't fail in his mission. So I want to come back to that at the end. But ever since that conversation in 2012, I've been thinking about the relationship between the Christian faith, specifically the New Testament, which I study, and serving the larger world apart from attempts to dominate it or to convert people or anything like that. Simply the attempt to serve humans wherever we find them and whatever need they have. That's been an interesting question to pursue. As I turned to the Bible, I quickly found that the Old Testament is filled with notions of what we might call the common good, the imperative to serve the stranger, the foreigner, the one who's not part of my religious community. But there were fewer of these in the New Testament. And I was a little bit unsettled by that until I started to think about it and study it a little more carefully. And I had to remind myself what the New Testament is. The New Testament is a collection of writings from a small, struggling Jewish sect that was trying to sort out who it was and how it related to the Jewish faith of which it was a part. And in that first century of the Common Era, it would have been presumptuous and a distraction to reflect at significant length on what it would mean for this little tiny group of several hundred Jews to be thinking about how their work would lead to flourishing in the Roman Empire. Doesn't mean they didn't care about it. In fact, I want to argue quite the contrary. But the documents that we have were primarily concerned to try to figure out what it meant for this group of Jews to say, Jesus is the Messiah, and furthermore, we're going to let Gentiles join us. That's mostly what the New Testament is about. So as I drilled in a little deeper, I realized it was not going to just be sort of laying around on the surface for me like it was in the Old Testament. And I discovered that the Gospel of Matthew was a really interesting place to make an entree into thinking about how the Gospel calls us to serve those beyond our religious community, beyond the church, and for reasons that don't have to do primarily with converting or submitting a culture or a people to our religious beliefs. So I've used the common good as a shorthand for talking about that. I'm not a political scientist. I'm very aware of that fact. So I know the kinds of things about the tradition of the common good in political discourse that you know if you went to a good liberal arts college. I know that the common good was something that Plato thought about in his work, especially the Republic. Cicero, the great Roman statesman, also wrote about the way that citizens of an empire should serve the common good, that they should work not for their own individual gain alone, but for the sorts of goods that were common to all the people of the empire. I know that Augustine, the great Christian theologian, in his work, The City of God, thought a great deal about what it meant to seek the common good, when one had, on the one hand, the vision of the community, the city of God, the community as it should be, but then the actual human community that we have that's marred by sin. Augustine actually had a pretty sophisticated view of the common good and knew that Christians had to think about the good of the world beyond their own, the walls of the church. This gets picked up in the great Roman Catholic philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas. In the 20th century, it's really in Catholic social teaching where we had most of the thinking about the common good. And I don't want to get caught up here in all of the really interested and sophisticated political science debates and philosophical debates about the common good and how it relates to the particular way we organize ourselves as a society. Does liberal democracy have a notion of the common good, or does it just adjudicate through process and procedure everyone's individual idea of the good, and helps to funnel that into something that might add up to a common good? Or the communitarians who say, no, we have to start in thinking about the organization of society with what we share in common. We work backwards then to notions of rights. So that's all interesting and complicated, and you would want to talk to a real expert about that, and there are probably several in the room right now. I'm interested in the common good as a looser kind of definition at the moment. The welfare, the well-being of an entire population of people, whether that's a community or a nation or a global community. And the way that the Christian gospel tells us to relate to the well-being and the flourishing of people generally, apart from our aims to witness to them or bring them into our fellowship or the like. So I'm looking for that imperative or that mandate, those models in Scripture that help us think about that particular issue. And I've been fascinated by this since my discussion with Dr. Massey, but it's really the contemporary situation, especially the political discourse and the political circumstances surrounding the current electoral season. We always think that the times we live in are worse than the ones we just came through. So I'm aware of that tendency to construct a narrative along those lines. But I'm sure in many rooms lately where people are talking about the tearing of the social fabric, the erosion of the social contract, a failure to articulate any vision of the common good that both parties would work toward, or all faiths might work toward. We were discussing earlier before we started that it seems like tribalism, kind of protecting our own good within some kind of well-defined community. That's really what we are experiencing in the present age, and there's a lot of hunger for the common good to be articulated, for a vision for it to be cast, and some way of achieving it to be laid out. And I think that the church has a role to play in that. I think the church has a way to model for society what it looks like to look beyond the interests of a group and think about the well-being of the whole. And I'm interested in what the New Testament might say to us about that. So the Gospel of Matthew will be a jumping off point, though we'll talk about some other texts. If you look at the handout, I give you an overview of the series. In this first lecture, I just want to lay some groundwork and look at the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. And there I want to just make a basic point about the fact that in Jesus' teaching, the kingdom of God that he proclaims is related to the human flourishing of every single human being and of all creation itself. This evening I want to talk about evidence that we have in the Scriptures from God's grace and agency working outside the boundaries of Judaism or Christianity. Tomorrow night, the lecture title is Loving Outside Our Comfort Zone. I want to look at places where we are told to relate in a loving and gracious ways to those outside of our community, and I want to especially focus on notions of civility, especially civility in speaking. And then the final lecture on Tuesday night, What God Cares About, will focus on this striking parable that Jesus tells of the sheep and the goats, or this apocalyptic vision. And we'll talk a little bit about the function of these apocalyptic visions. God separated humanity into two camps, the sheep and the goats, depending on how they had acted toward the most marginalized members of society. An absolutely provocative unsettling and really, really important text for our current topic. So without further ado, let's dive into the Gospel of Matthew. You've got some texts there in front of you, starting with Matthew 4:23 to 5:16. This is an interesting point in the Gospel of Matthew because Jesus is now coming out to do his public ministry. Up to this point, we've had the birth narrative about Jesus. We've had the scene of Jesus' baptism. We've had the encounter with Satan in the wilderness, that scene about Jesus' temptation. Jesus has called some disciples, and now, for the first time in Matthew, Jesus is coming out to address the people. So in Matthew, this sits in a really important place. This is the Sermon on the Mount, occupies 3 chapters, and this is the opening of the Sermon on the Mount. So in how Matthew has put this gospel together, this Sermon on the Mount has a prominent place. It's as if this is Jesus' inaugural address. I want to look a little bit at the setup that begins in Matthew 4:23. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogue. So Jesus has been building a following. But Matthew hasn't yet told us what that following consists. What is Jesus teaching? What is he saying? Why are people so excited? Why are people so anxious? He's proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. I want to come back to that. And curing every disease and every sickness among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he cured them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. 2 really important points to note before we dive into the Beatitudes themselves. This business of the good news of the kingdom. So if you were a first century Jew and a teacher, charismatic teacher, began speaking about the coming of the kingdom, you would have a fairly good sense of what that meant. Or at least you would think that you had a pretty good sense of what that meant. It would be a reference to God being the king for Israel and ruling Israel directly through some appointed individual, right? The earthly king, a David, a Saul. So Israel had spent 6 centuries in subjugation to foreign overlords. So they yearned to have a return to political autonomy and to be ruled by God through the king, to get the land back and the kingship back. This is what the hope for the kingdom was about. And that's tied to the hope for a Messiah. In Hebrew, Mashiach, an anointed one, a king. So we want to be in God's reign, where there's a king who's been appointed for us by God and who rules over us in our own land. So that expectation for the kingdom would have been widely known. So as a preacher, you could say, God's kingdom is coming, and people would know what you were talking about. There would have been various kinds of visions that preachers might have cast, and prophets, but basically it was this idea that the foreign overlords would be driven out and Israel would regain the land and the king. And that would be the kingdom of God. So here's this young charismatic preacher roaming around the countryside, big followers, talking about the kingdom. This gives you some idea of why he gets killed. Right here. That is a political message and was received as such. But we will see throughout the whole gospel, one of the goals of the gospel writers, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is to show you that Jesus' conception of the kingdom is quite radically different. It's not to say it's not political. That's a complex term, and people dismiss that too easily, as if though there's some easy distinction between a political message and a non-political message. Jesus is talking about the kingdom, and it has implications for how we live our lives and organize ourselves. But he has a very different idea of it than many of his Jewish contemporaries. And we'll want to look at how the Beatitudes begin to shape a vision of the kingdom that Jesus has, that his followers don't, and which he will attempt to instruct them in the course of the gospel. So the kingdom was a message that people would have recognized, but Jesus wants to really reinterpret what it means for God's kingdom to be coming imminently. And I want to just note briefly these great crowds that are following Jesus. They come from the Galilee, so Galilee was a mostly, though not exclusively, Jewish area. Jerusalem, Judea, again, not exclusively, but almost entirely Jewish areas. But the Decapolis refers to a region on the east side of the Sea of Galilee that was not a Jewish region. Those 10 cities there, that's what Decapolis means, would have been an area where there would have been very few, if any, Jews. And then generally the area beyond the Jordan, probably referring to areas north of that beyond the Jordan, would also have been probably fairly sparsely populated when it came to Jews. So what's interesting about this is that in Jesus' first great teaching session, you have both Jews and non-Jews present. It's pretty interesting. So you've got this great crowd. Jesus is talking about the kingdom, but you've got Jews and non-Jews present. So what is it that Jesus says? The first words out of his mouth in his public ministry in Matthew are these wonderful and well-known Beatitudes. And they're well-known to us, and that's great, but it also means they may have lost some of their grip and bite on us. So I hope to revisit some of these so that we can appreciate really how surprising it is that Jesus talks about them in this way. Jesus saw the crowds, went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, we might note just in passing that to go up on a mountain, and as Jesus, and to gather around the people and to teach them, and then Jesus is eventually, in this Sermon on the Mount, going to begin talking about the law. You have heard that it was said of old, right, in the law, but now I say to you. So Jesus is set up as sort of a new Moses here. He's up on that mountain, and he's proclaiming imperatives. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So the first word out of Jesus' mouth is already interesting. Blessed are the poor in spirit. There's a translation issue here that we should talk about briefly. I'm always hesitant to talk about those because it can make it sound like somehow there's something wrong with our English translations, and we have wonderful English translations. But this is an interesting one, and to appreciate what Jesus is doing here, I have to give you a little bit of a language lesson. There's a perfectly good Greek word for blessing. It's used in the New Testament all the time, and this isn't it. This is an entirely different word. In Greek, it's not even related. A much better translation of this, and you see this now in some translations, would be happy. But happiness, it can be understood sort of tritely, so maybe content. Content are the poor in spirit. Happy, like just in a harmonious place in life, are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Happy are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. So something odd is happening here. And happy are those who mourn sounds odd to our ears in the way it would have sounded to the people who were listening to Jesus. They said, whoa, wait a minute. We actually know this formula, this happy are those. Like, we get that, right? That's all over the Psalms and the Proverbs. but it's not those who mourn. It's not the gentle. It's not those who have who hunger and thirst for righteousness. If you flip over your sheet, I've given you just a couple of examples of how this language usually works. Psalm 1 is a great example. Happy are those. And now here we are in Hebrew. We have the word, and when they translate it in Greek, when they translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the word they use is the word that Jesus uses. So in other words, we're talking about the same formula here. Happy are those who who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. Psalm 40. Happy are those who make the Lord their trust, who do not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after false gods. Proverbs 3. Happy are those who find wisdom, and those who get understanding, for her income is better than silver, and her revenue better than gold. So the happy are those statements in the Psalms and the Proverbs have to do with people who obey God's law, and who consequently end up in a happy, contented situation in life. So one of the main threads that runs through Psalms and Proverbs is that God, the Creator, has designed the way of life that the creature should follow, and that's called the law. And if you follow that, it puts you in good stead with God. It will put you in good relationships with your neighbors. You'll make good decisions about life, and you won't oppress people, and you won't, and it'll go well with you. And one of so your life will be well put together if you follow God's law. So Jesus is really problematizing this here. That relationship between you will be happy and contented if you do well. And the flip side of that is that suffering, to be unfortunate, to be in a bad state of affairs, can somehow be linked to obedience to God or lack thereof. Even some Old Testament writers question that. Ecclesiastes is an example of kind of questioning that whole assumption. And here I would say it's questioned quite deeply and provocatively. So that Jesus here is disrupting the notion that somehow if you are in a bad way, if you are suffering, if you're mourning, if you find yourself at wit's end, if you find yourself at rock bottom, that's not somehow a function of your obedience or disobedience, but it's a function of a fallen world. And that's really foundational to what Jesus wants to say. I would say he really wants to remove here the idea that one can be excused from helping those who are marginalized based on some kind of thin theology that would suggest that they must be somehow responsible for their own state. So happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, and so forth. So Jesus is talking about this kingdom of God that's coming. And there's an important lesson here about the citizenry of that kingdom and where people are in that kingdom. Most human kingdoms would be characterized by the leading citizens being those who are wealthy, those who have power, those who are well connected. Those are the ones that would be the children of God, whom God would favor. But Jesus is saying, actually, in this kingdom that's coming, in my own person and work, the ones who really possess the kingdom, the one to whom the kingdom belongs is the one who suffers, the one who mourns, the one who struggles, the one who is merciful, the one who seeks justice. Those are the favored citizens of this kingdom. So those who find themselves on the margins of typical kingdoms are valued in God's kingdom. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Sometimes Matthew gets a bad rap because the Beatitudes that we find here are different than the ones we find in Luke. There's another, Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 7, often called the Sermon on the Plain. And there are similarities and differences. But Luke says, blessed are the poor. And so when Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit, he sometimes gets accused of spiritualizing the Beatitudes and not caring about people's physical state, but rather only their spiritual state. But I would submit to you it's actually a mischaracterization of what Matthew is doing. Poor in spirit is based on a well-known Hebrew idiom that means to be at a point in life where one cannot help oneself, that to have no resources for helping. We would say rock bottom. So those that cry out when they're poor in spirit, in the Jewish literature of the period, cry out because they have suffered circumstances or they're in a state in which they cannot help themselves and they can't imagine helping themselves. So the poor in spirit doesn't have to do with some kind of spiritual dryness or some kind of abstract interior state of affairs, but actually rather to being at a point in life where one is desperate and can do nothing other than call out for help. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That's grounded in our reality of suffering. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Again, meek is one of these translations that I think we could improve a little bit. It tends to suggest people who are timid or cowering. But if we go further in Matthew, Jesus actually calls himself meek. And the semantic domain of this word in Greek really suggests more like not ostentatious, more like quietly strong is how I often translate this for my students. So it doesn't have to do with being retiring or timid. It has to do with being in the world in a way that doesn't seek attention and draw praise and credit to oneself. So we're starting to get a picture of what the kingdom of God looks like in Jesus' eyes. It values those who are at the end of their rope. It has a heart for those who mourn. It values those whose work often goes unnoticed, which is crucial, right, for the running of things. The meek, the quietly strong. It lifts up those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And again, that phrase does not refer to a religious zealot, somebody who's always going around seeking after righteousness, but rather, in the cultural idiom, this would refer to somebody who hungers and thirsts for righteousness because they've been deprived of it somehow. They're bereft of it. So they're victims of injustice. Blessed are the merciful. So those who show mercy are prominent citizens in this kingdom. The pure in heart. We might translate that, those who have integrity and are sincere, something like that. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. This one is my favorite. Peacemaker is in Greek, just like it is in English. It's a word made up of two different words. And certainly someone who brings about a state of peace, who's able to get parties to cease from their conflict. I mean, that's valuable. We honor that. But this term is actually quite a bit larger than that. It rests on the Hebrew notion of shalom. And if you read your Old Testament, the word shalom has to do with complete well-being. It has to do with being in harmony with God and in harmony with neighbor in community. So when one is in a state of shalom, one is as one should be in the world, right with God and right with neighbors. So this is the term underlying the term peace here. So it's to create shalom. Blessed are those who create shalom. I often translate it this way. Blessed are those who create the conditions for human flourishing, for they will be called children of God. So I think that's a bit more vivid and dynamic than peacemaker. Blessed are those who create the conditions for human flourishing. A lot of people in this room in their work do that on behalf of all of us. Kind of work you do in civil service and in the government has the function of creating conditions for human flourishing. So what's so interesting to me about the Beatitudes is that Jesus says these right out of the gate in his ministry. And he says it to a mixed audience of people, Jews and non-Jews, and there's no qualifiers here at all. It doesn't say, blessed are Jews who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are proto-Christians who mourn, for they will be comforted. This states in rather stark and absolute terms that those whom God values enough to regard as leading citizens of the kingdom are defined by their, not by religious identity, but simply because God values and loves them. So it's quite a striking way to open. And because so much of the New Testament, as we would understand, is taken up with thinking about this community of Jews who's trying to figure out who they are, they're often talking about what it's like to be in this community, and the nature and the qualities, and loving one another and supporting one another and upholding one another, that when we get these places where the particularity of the Jewish community has passed away, and Jesus is simply talking about humans as God created them and how this kingdom relates to them, it's really significant. This is Jesus' opening word. He goes on to talk about salt and light. I want to round out here so we can have at least a few minutes for questions. So Jesus comes out of the gate, talks about the need for those who would be associated with the kingdom of God to be merciful, to create conditions for flourishing, because the folks who need flourishing, the folks who need mercy, the folks who need justice, are valued by God and part of that kingdom as well. And so the last part of this section becomes a call to action. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. So commentators sometimes struggle with this passage. What is this what is it for salt to lose its saltiness? And what is it that is being alluded to here? What is the good quality of salt that's being pointed to here? The question about whether salt not being good for anything anymore, if you read really snarky commentators, they'll say actually salt is stable, it doesn't lose its chemical properties. So I gather what this means is that when it gets exposed to humidity and it clumps up, and so that's what I'm gathering it means. But it's that use of salt that I think is interesting. So some commentators will say this has to do with the flavor that salt brings. And this is really significant for Christians to kind of be this vitality and bring this kind of life to the world. And I guess that's okay, and that's certainly possibly part of what Jesus is saying. But I'm inclined to think that what's in view here is salt's ability to preserve meats and other kinds of things. And what's interesting about salt is that it cures by not allowing bacteria to grow. It's too the saline concentration doesn't allow bacteria to grow. So that's an interesting image for followers of Jesus, right? Your way in the world should be that wherever you are, that which spoils, that which is toxic, that which harms and breaks down, we prevent that from happening. We oppose that. We stand in opposition to everything that tries to attack and break down that which is good. Just like salt doesn't allow meat to go bad because it doesn't allow the bad stuff to take root and to grow. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one after lighting a lamp puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand and gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and glory to your Father in heaven. That one's pretty straightforward, doesn't need a lot of explanation. But it's significant that those two concluding images to the Beatitudes are both ones in which it is suggested that followers of Jesus have to be out in the world. Salt does absolutely no good while it's in the salt shaker. You have to keep it somewhere So you keep it in a salt shaker or a salt cellar, but that's not where it belongs. It belongs out in the world, bringing life and taste and preserving that which is good against that which is bad and would tear it down. So salt isn't made for the shaker, just like light isn't meant to be put under a basket. So in just a few verses here, just a few minutes of oral presentation, Jesus is able to say, the kingdom of God that you might be expecting is not quite what I have in mind. The kingdom that I have in mind is one in which those that are thought to often be on the margins of a typical kingdom are going to be valued and near to God's heart. And the sort of people who help those folks, they're also close to God's heart. And so if you want to do that, you will need to get off your keisters on the side of this mountain and get out and be salt and light in the world. So as it relates to this question of the common good, I think it's a good opening word, because it clearly shows that Jesus is talking about the significance of every single human person when it comes to God's favor and care. And followers of Jesus are compelled to be part of God's giving an experience of that kingdom to every single person. So I think we've got time for just a few questions before you need to go to the second service. Or comments or rebuttals. Emily.
Shane, thank you for being here. I don't know if you knew, today we are completing a 4-week session on the Beatitudes.
All right, yeah, I did know that. Yeah.
You did know that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Okay,
that's why the rebuttal, so.
No, well, I was just feeling as though we were channeling one another. This notion of shalom, that was for peacemakers, was a new insight for me as I was preparing for today's sermon, and what that might look like for us, and how to bring that about, and how to help to convey that in the time that we're living in. That just wanted to underscore that. I share that with you, that desire for making that more real for one another.
Yeah, it's such a winsome idea, and so greatly in need. We can't turn around without encountering situations in our neighborhoods, in our cities, our nation, the world, in which there's the need for flourishing is great. And I think the command to create shalom, not just sort of nod in its direction or sort of dip in and out, right, of giving people shalom. I mean, we're called to create that shalom, so that means we have to roll up our sleeves. It's more than a feeling, and it's more than, I think, occasionally, right, intersecting with those who struggle and suffer, but actually thinking about what do I do in life that creates conditions, right, some kind of lasting, sustainable situation where people can experience the kind of shalom that I enjoy. Yes?
Are there messages in other major religions that parallel in any way Jesus' Sermon on the Mount?
Yeah, and again, you'd want to ask a different kind of scholar, but there does tend to be, I would say in most religions of which I am aware, a message that one is faithful to a tradition or to a God or to a teaching by serving humanity generally. I would say that one of the struggles of religions is that it seems to be common for there to be a struggle within a tradition about whether that idea is eclipsed by more sectarian sorts of notions. We see this very clearly in Christianity. We see a theocratic vision in some wings, that my relation to the larger populace is to make them all believe what I believe and to institute a way of life that is based on the Bible and my beliefs. The idea that all engagement with the outside world should be that of conversion, right? I encounter you and take you seriously insofar as I have a chance to make you believe what I believe. But if you don't, then not only am I have now a different view of you. I either dismiss you, I ignore you, I might even denigrate you. And it seems that Christians are not alone in this struggle. You find it in Judaism, you find it in Islam, you also find it in Eastern religions. So I wouldn't want to speak to all religious traditions, but the ones that I know all have, especially in their founders, right, and their key figures, this message that true piety entails serving the larger humanity, serving the common good as part of one's piety, but that there's a struggle within traditions and textual traditions especially, where that can be found eclipsed. Yes?
Well, first of all, this is so resonant and exciting. Thank you very much. This is the most muscular interpretation I've heard. I'm wondering why historically that has been interpreted as so metaphysical, and you say the meek and the lost, it's almost dismissive in scholarship history. What has changed?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll tell you what I think has changed. So, in the history of the church, the Beatitudes have a fascinating and unsettling kind of role. So, one of the things Luther tried, in medieval Catholicism, the basic view was the Sermon on the Mount, especially the Beatitudes, they are a way of life for the ascetic. For like, if you're at a monastic order, you might be able to live according to this, but it's not for regular Christians. And so Martin Luther wrestled with this, and not very satisfactorily, I would say, to say, well, we should probably think of some way, shape, or form this applies to all Christians. But it gives you some sense of the struggle. I think one of the things that has happened is the way the New Testament has been studied in the last 100 years, but really the last 30 or 40 years, as part of Second Temple Judaism. And so when you put this language in the context of the Judaism of the time, which entails that's serious historical inquiry and serious linguistic kind of study. David was referring to the weird publications that I have, most of which are related to the Dead Sea Scrolls or other sorts of Second Temple Jewish groups that are not well known in the mainstream. And that's where one begins to find the analogs for what you find in the Beatitudes. That's where you begin to understand how the language works, what kind of cultural resonance that it had. So once you see that this language is found in Jewish ethical discourse, then you begin to be able to understand it appropriately, and it becomes a little less untethered from the real world and a little less ethereal. So I would say one of the things that's happened is setting the New Testament within the study of first century Judaism, which just helps us to understand it with greater depth and clarity.
Thank you.
One more?
One more, sure, yeah.
It strikes me in your interpretation of the Beatitudes, and maybe for part of Martin Luther's problem with it, that this is a sermon about works, not faith.
Well, we want to keep those close together, right? We want to. The interesting thing, boy, this will take a long time to answer well, but it's certainly there is an emphasis here on action. But I think in Jesus' mind and the mind of the writers of the New Testament, that can't be divorced from what one believes about God and the world. When we get to Paul is the one that he makes us make this mistake, though I believe he doesn't himself make it. But with all the emphasis in Paul on faith, it begins to sound like a thing itself. Like you've got faith here and then you've got works. And so you get James, even in the New Testament, writing and saying, well, we've got to keep these things together. But I think that actually misunderstands kind of Paul's whole discourse about that. So I think that we struggle more with this division between faith and works Where in the first century Jewish mind, that would be actually a very difficult distinction to make. That one's belief about God flows into action in a way that makes it very hard to separate those out. So we Protestants, in our words and our doctrine, right, we really focus on getting our words lined up, getting those all right. And we then sometimes have to be reminded that we have to do more than talk about our belief and kind of line up our beliefs within coherent systems and actually do something. But I would say that's more our issue, which is a serious one, than it is with Jesus. So if I don't talk about the faith component here, it's simply my eliding it because it's so interwoven with how Jews think about serving God. So we can talk about that in some other sessions. It's actually a really interesting topic to pursue. But I can't think of an example outside of Paul, really, where faith and works get so.
Well, until you get down to Luther.
Well, but then
You refer to Luther's trouble with these.
right. So then they give us all these Protestant anxieties that we have and problems.
Wonderful.
Yeah.